Hi Chefeteers, I'm Chef Nakia and I want you to be more confident in the kitchen and reduce some of your at-home food waste this year. Yes, reducing our at-home food waste is super important to help the environment and lessen our impact on the environment, and it can also be super helpful for our wallets and our budgets. If we throw away less food, that means we are eating more of what we purchased, which means we don't have to go to the grocery store as often to restock, or we are getting more meals per grocery run. So I'm going to share a few strategies today that you may be able to incorporate into your meal planning and food preparation lives. In celebration of Earth Day coming up here, happy Earth Day. But also, whenever you establish these habits now, you can repeat them throughout the year and have a positive impact throughout the year, not just here in April in Earth Month. And for any of you who have been around for a while, you have probably heard me talk about reducing food waste a few times. It is something I'm very passionate about, so I do bring it into a lot of conversations, and I have already created a food waste video. And so it's been a while, so I wanted to do a refresher, and I'm not going to talk about all of the same stuff in this video as that video. So if you go back and watch the other Reduce Your Food Waste video, I am going to be talking about some different things. I'm not just repeating myself, but with better lighting and a better quality camera, I am going to share unique things in this video. Did you know that the average American throws away about 30% of the food that they purchase? And this includes food from the grocery store and leftovers from restaurants. So how many times do you bring a carton of leftovers home and you think you're gonna eat it for lunch or dinner the next day, and then a few days later you find it pushed in the back of the fridge and you're like, oh, oops, I guess it's time to throw that away. And then of course our ingredients from the grocery store that we might not get to, along with leftovers of the meals that we did cook at home and we just forgot to eat up the leftovers, or they didn't sound super appetizing so we didn't eat them. Whatever the reason may be, that is the type of food waste that I'm talking about at home. A small sliver of that too is the food that is not edible, as in, like, some people won't eat the stems of broccoli. And you can, it is edible, you can actually eat it. But a lot of recipes, when you read, it will call out specifically that it wants you to use the florets and not the stem. So that, like the tops, like the carrot tops, a lot of people also, if they purchase carrots that have the nice green leafy tops, they might not keep them and use them for something like a gremolata, or, you know, you can throw that into a pesto. So a sliver of the at-home food waste are these portions of ingredients that we might not be as accustomed to using up. But I would say for the most part, the bulk of it is those leftover meals that don't ever get around to being eaten, and leftover ingredients of you purchased it and then it feels like next thing you know it's slimy and moldy and in the fridge. So that's kind of going to be the focus of the video today. I just wanted to, I think when we hear a statistic like the average American wastes 30% of what they purchase, that's kind of staggering, and then kind of defining what that waste is made up of can already, just off the top, maybe give you a couple ideas of how you could already start reducing your waste at home. All right, so reducing your food waste at home always starts with having a plan. So creating some type of plan and listing out strategies that will work for you in reducing your at-home food waste, right? Because we all cook in different ways and have different, like, accessibility to compost, and different space availability in our homes for, saving food in different ways. As in, if you barely have space in your house for anything, you're probably not going to pickle a bunch of jars or like dry a bunch of food and have that saved, right? So picking out the strategies that we know will work with us, with our desires, with our time and our space availability is very important. So that way you don't set yourself up for failure by listing off a bunch of strategies that just realistically you're not going to be able to get to. And there are a lot of different ways and different habits we can implement into our lives to reduce food waste. So don't feel like, okay, starting tomorrow, I have to do 100 of these strategies, right? Slow and steady, right? Add in what do you feel like would be the easiest habit to add in tomorrow? And once you feel like that's flowing well, then you can add in another one, because it's much more likely that we stick with the habits that we add little by little, whereas if we do a complete overhaul, sometimes it can feel way too difficult to stick with it. So whenever you are creating your plan, think about kind of those 4 big categories that I talked about, like leftovers from restaurants, leftovers from meals you cook at home, ingredients at home, and then like portions of ingredients that you may or may not know are edible. Like, which of those 4 do you feel like you have the most of in your particular home? And which ones do you feel like you can realistically make changes with? If you think that using broccoli stem and carrot tops and researching all of the different parts of veggies that are edible, that you didn't know are edible, feels like a huge task, then maybe put that towards the end of your plan, right? Like, if you really get on a good kick with this, then maybe you can do some of that research and incorporate more of those things. But if it feels like too big of a task right now, don't start with it. Maybe eating up restaurant leftovers and meal leftovers feel like the 2 most doable. Well, one thing that I think is a great way to keep track of those kinds of things is to put dry erase board or a magnetic board, if your refrigerator is still magnetic, or a running sticky note sheet of paper, whatever will work for you, on your fridge front or your pantry door, or if you have a family command center where the mail and different things go and your weekly meal plan is posted there. Think of a place that's pretty visible. If you are really into it, you could make it the background screen of your phone or your laptop. But somewhere where it's going to be easy to see and to make adjustments to it. And anytime that you have any meal left over, write it down on that piece of paper and the date that you are putting it in the fridge. If you want to go the extra step, you can already create, put another date that's like an eat by date, like my own personal eat by date. And this will just instinctively in your mind, whenever you think about that food, you've already assigned an eat by date, and so you're gonna be more motivated to actually eat it. So if you go out to eat Friday night and you put leftovers in the fridge and in your mind you're like, I'm gonna eat this by Sunday, it's much, much more likely that you're actually gonna be able to eat that meal. Another little tip, if you sometimes struggle with eating meal leftovers because they just don't sound very satisfying, okay, I guess 2 tips here. Okay, so number 1, it is okay, and maybe try reheating a small portion of that meal and eat a bite or 2 and just see. Because sometimes the idea of something doesn't seem super appetizing, but once we have a bite or 2, we're like, oh, actually this is pretty good, or this reheated pretty well. And then you'll feel like, okay, cool, I want to eat the rest of it. And if you, at that point, take a couple bites and you're like, oh, I really don't want this, then it's okay, and you're not sitting there trying to force yourself to eat something that you don't want to eat, and then you end up like throwing half of it in the trash because you don't want to reheat it and cool it and reheat it and cool it, you know, too many times. So just be kind to yourself. Ask yourself to be a little curious and take a bite or two, and then proceed from there. All right, and then kind of the second tip is get creative with how you reheat things, and like how you maybe add special different items as you reheat them. So the microwave, as we know, is really great at getting like 10% of your food really, really hot and leaving the rest of it very cold. So I do rarely reheat food in the microwave, and I totally understand that for time reasons and accessibility, the microwave might be your only choice. But if you do have a stovetop or a toaster oven, like that guy right over there, around, or even like an air fryer, if you have an appliance like that, a lot of times different leftovers will be reheated a lot better in a different way. So if you want a kind of crispy, like if there's a crispy element to this dish, and you want to bring that back up whenever you reheat it, using a toaster oven, an oven, air fryer, whereas in the microwave, and if it is the type of leftover that is fairly moist, I know a lot of people don't like that word, but if it's like kind of wet, then a lot of times heating it up on the stove is going to be a good option, because you can continue stirring it as it is heating up over usually like a low heat I'll do. And that will allow everything to reheat more evenly, and you can add more like vegetable stock or milk or water or whatever is appropriate for like the flavor profile that's going on there. Because over time, a lot of times the food will absorb more and more moisture, and so like if it is a soup, you might not have as much of a broth as you did when you originally made it. So heating it up over the stove, you can slowly add more stock to get it back to be like the texture that you do want. And if you feel like, oh my gosh, this is so boring, I ate like the same thing yesterday and I'm kind of tired of the flavors, add a different sauce to it, or add a different seasoning. Or if you cooked a meal that has like the starch and the veggie that's different than the protein of it, you could, and you have like a couple meal leftovers kind of like that, you could pair, right, the protein portion from Monday with the side dish portion from Tuesday and a brand new starch, and maybe that's enough to like re-excite you about that food. And again, with a little different sauce or seasoning or something like that, maybe it can change the flavor profile without like taking too much more time or effort. You can have a pretty big impact on your taste buds and your excitement about the dish. Last tip that's really focused on these kinds of like meal leftovers is check your food storage containers. However you like to save your leftovers, the more airtight, the better, typically. And so if you have containers with cracks in them, or like the lid is maybe cracked or something like that, then you might be letting more air in and out, which can reduce the length of time that your food will be good. And it can be tough whenever we're talking about like wanting leftovers to last as long as possible, while also keeping in mind food safety, because we don't ever want to make ourselves sick by eating something that has too much bacteria or yeast or mold growth in it. But we also don't want to necessarily be throwing food away that is still safe to eat, that like we could eat, but we're just throwing it away because we are unsure. So the more air movement within your food storage container means the higher likelihood and the more bacteria that's able to get in and do its thing. So if you have some food storage containers, maybe they're like nice glass ones and the lid is plastic and it's cracked over time, you're like, don't know how or where to buy new lids. But I also, like, this glass is really nice. One tip to make that same container go a little bit further is you could use plastic wrap or beeswax wrap. So you put the leftovers in the glass dish, add the wrap on top, kind of press it onto the food, and then add the lid on top of that. And so you kind of have like a double layer of protection there for your food. Now, this right here is a beeswax wrap. I was trying to warm it up in my hand quickly. My hands aren't very warm. But basically what it is fabric with this beeswax coating on it, which as you see, it makes it a little bit sticky. And so you can put like food in it and wrap it up. And then you just kind of, you know, seal the top of it and it sticks together. And also, as I had mentioned, you can use it as like a bowl cover, or in place of plastic wrap. In general, this is like meant to be a replacement for plastic wrap. Don't wash these in hot water or else you wash off the beeswax wrap solution. And they'll leave your fingers like a little bit tacky, a little borderline sticky, but I have not ever noticed any sort of weird flavor like migration or anything with my food. So it's definitely safe to use on food, and it's not gonna mess up like the flavors of your food or anything. And it's a great replacement to plastic wrap. And I'm not selling this or anything. I just love them, and it's another very like eco-conscious swap away from plastic wrap. I will say there are things that like you're gonna want to use plastic wrap for. Like, don't use this for raw meat, but there are times when you can use that instead of plastic wrap, and you can reuse it and reuse it, whereas plastic wrap is like one and done, sadly. Last tip with the food storage containers is if you don't have ones that are see-through, you might want to consider the next batch that you bring into your home that they're nice and see-through, because whenever you can see exactly what is in that container, you are probably going to be more likely to grab it out. And you know, it's like that reminder. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about if you tend to struggle with having a lot of leftovers of the ingredients. And this could be something that isn't necessarily a consistent issue for you. Maybe there are particular times when you tend to do a larger than normal grocery shop, and then you realize, oh no, I threw away like 25% of the fresh produce I brought home. And I guess the first thing is that, you know, you don't have to buy fresh produce all of the time. Sometimes, absolutely, there is a flavor and a texture, a desired flavor and texture that you can only get from fresh. So, absolutely, there are times when I personally, I definitely opt for fresh. But you can go with frozen veggies and canned veggies. There's nothing inherently wrong or bad about those. Please don't believe anybody out there who is saying that like a canned vegetable is bad or anything. Like, frozen veggies, canned veggies, nutritionally and everything, they're great as long as the like flavor and texture that they're going to result in is something that you are wanting for your dish. Then like, by all means, do that instead. And those are a lot of times going to last a heck of a lot longer than the fresh produce that you bring home. Okay, another tip for this fresh ingredients is you can put a bin or designate a specific drawer or shelf in your refrigerator that is the like use now shelf, right? Or the use now bin. And so anytime you pick up something in your refrigerator and you're like, ooh, this is kind of on its like last leg, you would put it in that spot. And then later that day when you go to cook, or whenever you have a little bit of time in your day, then you can go to that bin, see exactly what's in there, and either make a meal out of it or figure out a way to like preserve it for longer, whether that is like pickling it or thinly slicing it and dehydrating it. Whatever ways you've like figured out works well for your routines. You can also do this in your pantry. A lot of times the items that we have in our pantry have a much longer shelf life than what we're talking about for the refrigerator, but there may be some things in there that you're wanting to use up soon. So you could also designate a bin in your pantry just to keep those things like top of mind, right? A lot of these strategies have to do with like implementing ways to remind ourselves before it's too late, right? Remind ourselves to eat this up before we have to throw it away. Now, sometimes I run into this, I'm sure you have in the past too, where you go to the grocery store looking for a specific ingredient and the merchandising size is just kind of a silly amount. It's like, I'm definitely not gonna use all of that in this one recipe that I wanted to buy this for. And you may or may not have other meals planned already that are using up that ingredient. And are you actually going to change up your entire meal plan just because you had to buy like 4 pounds of cilantro instead of the 1 ounce or ½ ounce that you're actually going to use? Like, really? Are you gonna change your whole meal plan and like effectively change it so that now some of the other ingredients you bought aren't going to go bad? Right, so there are just times whenever the quantity that is available at the store does not make a ton of sense for how we're going to use it. In those cases, you could try shopping smaller and more local. And of course, there's a whole conversation about accessibility to options. But throughout the year, that accessibility could change a lot too. Potentially at a farmer's market or at a small market where there's a lot more like personal interaction, you may be able to work out a deal where they're willing to sell you a smaller amount of whatever that is. They might be willing to break a bundle in half and price it specially for you. Whereas, a larger grocery market, there might not really be many people around who can help you, or they might not be willing to, be a little creative with you. So it never hurts to ask, no matter where you're at, to see if they are willing to sell you a smaller size than what is merchandised. And or you could, if you have like friends or neighbors or coworkers or anybody like that, and you find that this happens with some of the same ingredients over and over again, you could maybe try to work out a deal with a couple people and say, whenever you want to, let's say it's flat leaf parsley, whenever you are planning to go to the store and buy parsley, beforehand you text 2 or 3 people and say like, hey, I'm gonna buy parsley. Does anybody want like 25% of a bundle? And then you can give them your leftovers as soon as possible. That way they can use it up before it gets wilty and gross. And then maybe they do the same for you another time, right? They might be saying, hey, I'm gonna go to the store and get cilantro and I'm not gonna use all of it. Do you want the other half or whatever it may be? Right, so, let's share when we can. And if that's not an option and you do have to buy the full amount, consider if you could, so these like the leafy herb example is something I've been using a lot. So let's take that further. Can you then turn that into a chimichurri sauce, a gremolata, a pesto, any other type of sauce? Could you make a salsa or like use those leafy herbs in something that can last longer than the herb will itself? And make sure it's something that you will actually eat up and use up. Now, a lot like these sauce options that I told you, a lot of them can go in the freezer. Be sure to label it so that you know what it is. But if you have the time to, whenever you're cooking whatever it is that you're cooking with that herb, then you also on the side are making this quick sauce, then that can be super helpful. I've also seen the hack of like, you get one of those old-fashioned ice trays where you fill it up with water and then put it in the freezer, and instead of filling it all the way with water, you fill it maybe halfway or so, and then you put your washed leafy herbs in there and you freeze it, And then once it's frozen, then you can take it out of that ice tray and put it in like a resealable bag or container and label it with what it is. And then whenever you go to thaw it, like each cube is a more usable amount, and it will then create like an herb, more of an herb paste, right? So you're not gonna have these beautiful fresh herbs on top of a dish as like a nice garnish, but then you can use that in like the leftover cilantro in like a green chili enchilada sauce, right? That would be a great way to use up those frozen and thawed herbs. So, right, like I said at the beginning, like having a plan, then you can kind of deal with these extras as soon as you realize you have them. And later on, you know, you can just pull out that ice cube from the freezer, which saves you some time, and it avoids having to buy a whole nother big bundle of cilantro from the grocery store just to maybe waste half of it. So it's not that time consuming to go out of your way to like do these extra things to save the herbs and stuff. It's just about doing it at the right time so that it is convenient, and you aren't trying to save it after it's too late, after it's already wilty. Incorporating new habits into your routines to reduce your at-home food waste can feel like it takes a good amount of mental effort at the beginning, but once they're implemented, they're definitely things that you don't have to like consciously think about much, right? Once it's a routine, it's something that we do without thinking. Once it's a habit, it's something we don't really have to think about doing. And so a few routines that can at the beginning feel like kind of another step, but once it's implemented, it will really just feel like, oh, this is how I prepare food now. Is whenever you are doing any kind of like vegetable slicing, dicing, trimming, whatnot, peeling, have a resealable bag or a food storage container of some kind that you typically keep in the freezer. Pull that out of the freezer, put it right next to your cutting board as you're chopping veggies, and put the peels and the stems and like the trim pieces into that same freezer bin. Don't put anything that's like moldy or slimy, like anything that you're like, I wouldn't eat that because it looks like it might make me sick. Like, definitely toss that right away. But it's like the stems, the stuff that's not laden with bacteria, but that you aren't just gonna eat. Put that in that freezer bin and save it up, and then you can make stock out of it. You can make vegetable stock, or if you use rotisserie chickens a lot, then you can save the bones from the rotisserie chicken, do that and the veggies together, and then you have chicken stock. And then you can use that chicken stock for soups and sauces and just all kinds of like bases. And yeah, chicken stock or veggie stock at the store isn't very expensive, but if you can make it at home and you get kind of a second life out of some of these things that we would normally just toss in the trash, it can just make you feel like you are, you know, supporting eco-friendly ways. And once you have that habit down, then you can kind of tell yourself like, oh yeah, I implemented that and I'm using it daily or weekly or whatever. And it's not that hard. Like, what else can I do? Like, how much more can I do to reduce my at-home food waste? Another easy thing is you can keep a pickle jar, like a large glass jar, even if it's not a pickle jar, but like a larger glass jar that will then one day make pickles. So you can put veggies in there, and you know, there's kind of a limit to it, right? So this could be a weekly kind of practice where throughout the week you add leftover random veggies into it, and then Saturday morning you make your pickling brine and you pickle those veggies. And then, you know, you give it like 24, 48 hours and you've already got a great snack that you could just grab out of the fridge. And if you want, you can also dice those up into kind of like a giardiniera, so it adds a nice like salty, pickly topping to a lot of different dishes. And once you get in the habit of doing that, again, it's not going to take much like mental focus or effort to keep doing it. And it's a quick pickle, so like you don't have to go through the full like canning process and everything. The idea is pickle it quickly to give us a couple extra weeks and then eat that stuff up. And bread, save your bread before it gets moldy. It's really easy to make breadcrumbs or croutons, and then those croutons could even eventually become breadcrumbs if you aren't using the croutons. So outside of like sandwich bread, like Wonder Bread, the really thin ones, most breads can make really great breadcrumbs and croutons. Sourdough, ciabatta, baguette, all of those kinds of breads. If you know you aren't going to eat them in the next day or two, and it's like right at that time where they've about lived their life, you just dice them into like large dice, maybe like 3/4 of an inch by 3/4 of an inch cubes, and toss them in some olive oil, season them however you like to season your breadcrumb or your croutons, and then put them on low heat in the oven for like 15-20 minutes. And really you just want to dry that bread out. And once it's dried out, then again, you can store them in like a resealable bag or container and add them to your salads or on top of your soups. If you get to a point where you feel like those croutons have been around for a while and you're just really not eating through them, you can put them in a food processor and process them down to breadcrumbs. Or you can put them in, like a bag or something and hit it with a rolling pin to like mush them up. It might be a good way for someone in the house to get out some aggression. And then once they are breadcrumbs, then you can use them to, bread chicken or fish, or to thicken up. Sometimes we use breadcrumbs in soups if we want like a thicker texture. So bread is something that goes bad pretty quickly, but it is pretty easy to figure out a way to dry it out and keep eating it, even though it's not necessarily like nice fresh slices of bread. So I hope that some of these routines and habits are things that you could envision yourself doing. And I think that habit sandwiching is a great way to get a little bit more consistent with habits, and habit sandwiching is just a fancy way of saying that you are putting a new habit in between two established old habits. So if you normally, like whenever maybe you're doing meal prep, maybe you normally meal prep on Sundays, if you normally wash and chop your vegetables and then cook chicken breast on the stove, you can sandwich in the middle of that, saving scraps for chicken stock. And maybe even like making chicken stock. So maybe you have saved scraps, and then whatever veggies you're prepping at that time, then those are the last scraps that kind of fill up the bin. And then you can start a pot of water boiling on the stove to make your stock in. And you're already looking at the stove for the chicken. So really, in the grand scheme of things, you're not adding that much more time to your established routines. So anytime that you can just kind of mush a new habit, and hopefully a habit that helps you reduce your food waste in between two existing habits, then it's much quicker to repeat that habit over and over again. And every little change that we make really can add up. And if we all focus on trying to reduce our at-home food waste, then maybe we can purchase less. And that'll help our budgets, but it can also help our environments, and it can help prevent so much going in the trash can and then to the landfill. Of course, if you have the availability and the accessibility to compost, I highly recommend that. Compost isn't number one though, right? It's not the number one way. It's like, okay, we've tried to prevent that food from going bad in these other ways, and it did go bad, but if we could at least compost it instead of sending it to the landfill, then we can cut down on some methane waste. And I know it's a big, huge problem, and it can feel like, okay, how does one person have an impact. How does one person have an impact? But maybe you doing it will inspire others around you to do it, and then you have a whole community of people trying to reduce their food waste. And then, you know, it can even grow from there. So thank you so much, Chefeteers, for joining me today. I'll put up a new video every other Wednesday, so if you want to be notified when the next one comes out, be sure to subscribe. And if you liked this video, like it below. And then if you want more tips for reducing food waste, go back to my older video, and I will always continue sharing strategies for reducing food waste. Thank you, Chefeteers.